The alien queen returned to secure her children. A human was already there. The signal arrived on a Tuesday. Not in the dramatic sense. No blinding flash across the sky, no trembling of instruments, no klaxon alarms echoing through mission control. It arrived the way most world-changing things arrive. Quietly, embedded in noise, noticed first by software and only later by a tired graduate student who almost dismissed it as interference from a faulty antenna array in the Atacama Desert. Dr. Yuna Seo was 29 years old. She had been awake for 19 hours. She was eating instant noodles over a keyboard when the pattern recognition subroutine she had spent 8 months refining flagged a 0.003-second repeating modulation buried beneath the cosmic microwave background. A background humans had been cataloging for decades without understanding how complete it truly was. She almost hit ignore. She didn't. The signal, as it would later be analyzed by 17 independent international teams across 4 continents, was not a greeting. It was not a warning. It was something far more mundane and far more profound. It was a navigation pulse. The kind a ship uses to locate a fixed point in space. The kind you send when you already know where you're going, and you simply need to confirm the destination is still there. The destination, triangulated by the SETI Cooperative and independently verified by ESA's Deep Space Monitoring Network within 72 hours, was not Earth. It was Kepler 442b, a rocky, marginally habitable world approximately 1,200 light-years from the Sun, a planet humanity had been quietly, carefully observing for 11 years through orbital relay telescopes deployed during the Second Deep Survey Initiative. A world with a thin nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere. A world with liquid water at its equatorial band. A world that, according to spectroscopic analysis, showed faint but non-zero biosignatures in its lower cloud layer. A world that, as of 4 years prior, also had a small human presence. Not a colony, that word was too grand. A research installation. Outpost Meridian, jointly operated by the United Nations Scientific Frontier Program and the Eurasian Space Cooperative, staffed by 11 people whose primary job was to breathe recycled air, maintain sensor arrays, and document the slow chemical processes of an alien biosphere from behind sealed observation domes. 11 people. The signal suggested something considerably larger was on its way to the same coordinates. Within 48 hours of Dr. Seo's discovery being verified, the information was no longer academic. It moved from astronomy journals to secure government channels, from scientific conferences to intelligence briefings. The United Earth Defense Coordination Office, an organization most people had never heard of, funded quietly through infrastructure budgets across 12 member nations, was activated for the first time in its operational history for a non-drill scenario. Commander Lena Vasquez, former ESA mission planner and current head of UEDCO's First Contact Response Division, received her briefing at 3 o'clock Geneva time in a room with no windows. She read the signal analysis twice. She looked at the trajectory model. She looked at the estimated arrival window. She asked one question: how long until it reaches Kepler 442b? The answer was 14 months. She asked her second question: what's our fastest resupply vector to Outpost Meridian? The answer was 11 months, assuming immediate launch authorization, full fuel burn, and a crew willing to skip deceleration margins that most mission planners considered non-negotiable. Vasquez noted the 3-month gap between those two numbers. She was quiet for a long time. "Get me a crew roster," she said finally. "Volunteers only. Tell them what they're flying toward." The crew that eventually boarded the UNSC Aegis Actual, a modified deep survey vessel retrofitted with military-grade sensor packages, emergency communication relays, and 6 months of additional life support, numbered 7. They were not soldiers, not in any traditional sense. There were 2 xenobiologists, a structural engineer, a communications specialist with a background in signal theory, a medical officer who had previously done 3 tours in Mars orbital medicine, a mission commander named Captain David Okafor who had spent 12 years flying long-haul survey routes in the outer system, and one individual whose title on the manifest read First Contact Protocol Advisor, a 47-year-old linguist and cognitive anthropologist named Dr. Harlow Chin who had spent his career studying how minds build meaning from unfamiliar patterns. None of them had ever done anything like this. Neither had anyone else. The public was told very little. Not out of deception. The member states of the UNFP were remarkably candid in their official communications, but because there was genuinely very little to say. A signal had been detected. Its origin was consistent with an artificial source. A response mission was being evaluated. More information would follow. The internet predictably was not calm. But in the quiet rooms where decisions were actually being made, The atmosphere was something closer to focus than fearful. The signal was a navigation pulse. Navigation pulses implied intent. Intent implied intelligence. Intelligence implied, possibly, cautiously, not definitively, the capacity for reason. That was something to work with. Dr. Chin spent the night before launch sitting alone in the Aegis Actual's small observation bay, looking out at the dock lights of L2 station reflected against the black. He had a recording device running. A habit from fieldwork, he always documented his thinking before entering an unknown environment. What we know, he said quietly to no one, is limited. We know something is coming. We know it knows where it's going. We don't know if it knows we're already there. We don't know what there means to it. We don't know if our presence changes anything. He paused. We don't know if the planet is theirs. He turned that thought over for a long moment. We don't know if it was ever ours to go to. He stopped the recording. He looked at the stars. He thought about the 11 people currently breathing recycled air on a world 1,200 light-years away, going about their carefully documented routines, probably unaware that something was approaching that had navigated to their exact location with the calm precision of a being returning to a place it already knew. Not discovering. Returning. That distinction would matter. He was already certain of it. Aegis Actual departed L2 station on March 14 at 6:42 Universal Time Coordinated. The mission timeline was brutal. 11 months of high-burn transit, minimal margin, maximum risk. The crew had been briefed on every contingency that UEDCO's analysts could model. They had protocols for detection, for communication attempts, for emergency extraction of Outpost Meridian's personnel, for scenarios that ranged from peaceful contact to something considerably less structured. They had no protocol for what they would actually find. Nobody did. Because the thing about first contact, the thing that every simulation, every model, every theoretical framework built by humanity's best minds consistently underestimated, was that the universe does not run on human timelines. The signal had been a navigation pulse. But the ship that sent it had not sent just one. And the second pulse, detected by the Aegis Actual's deep array sensors 6 weeks into transit, came from a different vector entirely. Closer. Much closer. Outpost Meridian had been designed to be invisible. Not in any classified or militarized sense. The outpost carried no weapons, filed no security designation, and had been publicly listed in the UNFP's annual infrastructure manifest since its deployment. Invisible in the practical sense. Its surface footprint was minimal, its electromagnetic emissions carefully managed, its thermal signature suppressed by insulation systems initially developed for cold weather geological survey work on Titan's northern plateau. The design philosophy had been simple and sensible. When you set up a research station on someone else's planet, or potentially someone else's planet, you don't announce yourself loudly. Dr. Priya Mehta, Outpost Meridian's current station director, had been on Kepler 442b for 14 months. She had 6 months remaining on her rotation. She was, by her own description, deeply bored in the best possible way, the kind of bored that comes from doing careful, methodical science in a place of genuine wonder, where every new atmospheric reading or soil sample carried the possibility of meaning something enormous, but usually just meant you updated a database and wrote a cautious notation in the margin. She was reviewing a 3-week accumulation of lower atmosphere particulate data when the alert came in. Not from Earth. From the outpost's own perimeter sensor array, a ring of passive monitoring instruments buried in the regolith at a 2-kilometer radius around the dome complex, designed to detect seismic activity, large weather events, and anything else that might warrant attention. The alert category was unclassified atmospheric event. The data attached to it was not atmospheric. Meta had a protocol for anomalies. Everyone at Meridian did. The outpost ran on protocols, because 11 people on a world 1,200 light-years from home cannot afford improvisation as a primary operational mode. The protocol for an unclassified sensor alert was verify, document, report, wait for guidance. She verified. The readings were real. She documented. The documentation took longer than usual, because the readings did not fit any category in the standard event library. She reported. The lightspeed delay to Earth was approximately 1,200 years, a fact that was, in this moment, not a technical footnote but a weight she felt physically. Whatever guidance might eventually be offered was already irrelevant before it could arrive. She was reporting to history, not to anyone who could help her. She did not wait. What the perimeter sensors had detected was, in the simplest physical terms, a disturbance in Kepler 442b's upper ionosphere. Not a strike. Nothing had entered the atmosphere. Something had passed through the upper magnetosphere at a distance close enough to cause measurable electromagnetic perturbation, then corrected its trajectory and established what the sensor array's modeling software, after running 6 successive interpretation passes, classified with 91% confidence as a stable orbital insertion. Something was in orbit around Kepler 442b. It had arrived without announcement, without the kind of deceleration burn signature that human vessels produced, suggesting either a propulsion system that operated on principles the outpost's instruments were not calibrated to measure, or a mass-to-velocity ratio that implied a vehicle far larger than anything humanity had placed in orbit around any world, including Earth. Meta called her 11-person team into the main operations bay. She showed them the data. She did not dramatize it. She did not need to. "We have approximately 40 minutes of data," she said. "The object is in a stable low orbit. Orbital period is consistent with a vehicle massing between 40 and 400,000 metric tons. The range is wide because our sensors weren't built for this. It is not tumbling. It is maintaining attitude. That means it is either operational or was designed to maintain attitude passively, which implies engineering sophistication." She let that sit for a moment. "It has not communicated with us. It has not altered its trajectory toward the surface. It has not done anything except exist in orbit. That is, for now, the complete sum of what we know." Dr. James Tao, the outpost's junior xenobiologist, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Do they know we're here?" Meta looked at him steadily. "I don't know. Our electromagnetic profile is minimal. Our thermal signature is suppressed. We designed the station specifically to avoid drawing attention." She paused. "That may have worked. Or it may be entirely irrelevant. We don't know what their sensors look like." The room was quiet in a way that had texture to it. "What do we do?" asked Dr. Fatima al-Rashid, the geochemist, the oldest person in the room at 53, a woman who had spent 30 years doing science in extreme environments and had never once looked frightened at a data reading. She looked slightly frightened now. "We observe," Meta said. "We record everything. We do not change our electromagnetic profile. We do not attempt communication without a coherent signal framework, and we don't have one. We maintain normal operations as much as possible." She looked around the room at 11 faces. "And we understand that this situation is outside any protocol we were given, and that we are making decisions that will matter for longer than we can calculate. So we make them carefully." For 18 hours the object in orbit did nothing. The team documented everything: orbital parameters, magnetospheric effects, the faint but consistent thermal bloom detected on the object's sunward face that implied internal heat generation at a scale consistent with either active life support or propulsion systems in standby mode. They built a model of the vehicle as best they could from passive data. The working estimate settled on something roughly 2.3 kilometers in length and 400 meters in its widest cross-section, moving in a near-circular equatorial orbit at approximately 340 kilometers altitude. It was, by any measure, extraordinarily large. It was not, the team noted carefully, a weapon. Weapons do not need to be that large. What needed to be that large was something closer to a transport. Something that carried things, or people, or whatever the equivalent was, across extraordinary distances. 18 hours after orbital insertion, it moved. Not toward the surface. Not toward them. It rotated, a slow, deliberate change in attitude that brought one end of the vessel to face directly downward, toward the planet's equatorial band below. Then it began to deploy something. The sensor array caught it as a cluster of objects separating from the main hull. Small relative to the parent vessel. The deployment was methodical, precise, and took 4 hours. When it was complete, 7 smaller objects were distributed in a dispersed formation in low orbit, each one maintaining its own stable attitude, each one emitting the same faint thermal signature that suggested active internal systems. Meta watched the data come in and said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "They're not here for us." Tao looked at her. "How do you know?" She pulled up the spectroscopic map she'd been working on for 14 months, the one that showed the distribution of complex organic molecular chains in Kepler 442b's equatorial cloud layer. She overlaid the orbital positions of the 7 deployed objects. Each one sat directly above a dense cluster of biosignature readings. "Because they're here for something else," she said. "Something already on this planet. Something they care about enough to send a ship this size." She studied the map. "And whatever it is, it's directly beneath us." The biosignature clusters had always been the most interesting part of the data. Meta had written about them in her quarterly reports, Cautious, methodical language, the kind of language that serious scientists use when they want to flag significance without overstating certainty. Anomalous concentration of complex organic indicators in equatorial subsurface stratum. Consistent with either advanced geological chemistry or biological activity of unknown classification. Further study recommended. Further study had been ongoing for 14 months. What it had produced, slowly and without drama, was a picture that no one at the outpost had been fully prepared to confront. The equatorial subsurface of Kepler 442b was not empty. Not in the way a geologically active world is not empty, full of minerals and heat and chemical processes. Empty in the biological sense. The complex organic chains Meta's team had been documenting were not the random products of abiogenesis. They were structured. They recurred in patterns. They responded, subtly, measurably, over timescales of weeks, to changes in atmospheric pressure and light cycle in ways that passive chemistry simply does not. Something was alive in the subsurface. Or something had been alive there, and left behind signatures too organized to be coincidence. The team's working hypothesis, debated carefully and never stated with confidence in any official document, was that they were looking at a dormant biosphere, an ecosystem that had retreated underground possibly millions of years ago, in response to some surface-level catastrophic event. The thin atmosphere above them, the scarred and weathered terrain, the chemical composition of the upper soil layer, all of it was consistent with a world that had once been more habitable and had since contracted. What lived below, if it lived at all, had adapted. Meta pulled the full 14 months of subsurface data and laid it against the deployment pattern of the 7 orbital objects. The correlation was not approximate. It was exact. Each deployed vehicle sat in a stationary orbit above one of the 7 highest density biosignature clusters. The precision required to achieve that placement on a first approach, without, as far as the team's instruments could determine, any prior survey activity, implied one of two things. Either the approaching vessel had access to sensor technology that made Outpost Meridian's instruments look like stone tools, or they had been here before. Dr. Chen's voice, the Aegis Actual, was still months away, but Meta had begun composing a structured log addressed to the incoming crew, because it helped her think, came to mind. She was not a linguist or an anthropologist, but she understood what returning meant versus arriving for the first time. Everything about the orbital deployment looked like returning. The first surface contact came on day 3. One of the 7 orbital objects had moved, not dramatically, a subtle orbital decay that could have been natural if it had not been so controlled, so precise. It dropped to 180 kilometers altitude. Then it deployed something smaller still. A single vehicle that entered the atmosphere on a trajectory that Meridian sensors tracked with increasingly poor resolution as it descended below the ionosphere into the cloud layer. Meta had the team gather around the sensor display. Nobody spoke. The descent vehicle, they were calling it that for lack of a better term, did not head for the surface. It leveled out at approximately 40 kilometers altitude, well above the ground but well within the cloud layer where the highest density organic signatures had been recorded. It moved in a slow spiral pattern over the equatorial band. Not searching. The movement was too deliberate for searching. Surveying. Checking. Confirming. It's doing an inspection, said Dr. Rashid. Of what? Tao asked. Rashid looked at the biosignature map. Of whatever's down there. It already knows what's down there. It's confirming condition. Meta nodded slowly. A parent checking on children it left behind. The room went very still. The implication of that framing took hold of the outpost with the quiet force of something self-evidently true. Nobody had said it before, nobody had let themselves say it because the full weight of it was considerable, but once Meta said it, the data rearranged itself around the idea with uncomfortable clarity. The entities aboard the vessel in orbit had not come to explore Kepler 442b. They had come back to it. Whatever lived in the subsurface of this world, the structured, responsive, distributed biological network that Meta's team had been cautiously documenting for over a year, was not a native ecosystem evolving independently. Or it was, but not independently. It was something that had been placed here, or tended here, or simply known about and cared for across timescales that made human space travel look like a first tentative step across a threshold. The planet was not abandoned. It was, for lack of any more precise language, a nursery. And 11 humans had set up a research outpost in the middle of it. Meta spent 2 hours alone in the operations bay after the rest of the team had gone to their quarters. She was not panicking. She had thought about this. She thought about it the way she thought about every difficult problem. Methodically, with as much information as she had, making decisions on the basis of what was known rather than what was feared. What was known? The orbital vessel was technologically superior to anything humanity had built by a margin that was difficult to quantify but easy to feel. It had arrived without warning, deployed precision survey vehicles, and was conducting operations on and around this planet with a confidence that spoke of deep familiarity. It had not, in 3 days, made any aggressive movement. It had not altered the outpost's atmospheric or electromagnetic environment in ways that suggested hostile intent. It had not, as far as the sensors could determine, directed any particular attention toward the small cluster of structures sitting on the surface beneath its orbit. What was not known? Whether that absence of attention was intentional tolerance, simple oversight, or something else entirely. Whether the organisms in the subsurface were in any way harmed or affected by the presence of 11 humans living above them. Whether the beings in orbit understood what humans were. Whether any of that was about to change. Meta opened her log. She spoke carefully, knowing that her words would be reviewed by people making decisions she could not yet imagine. "I don't believe we're in immediate danger," she said. "I believe that we are, almost certainly, in a location that has significance to whatever intelligence is currently in orbit above us. I believe that significance predates our presence here by an interval I cannot calculate." She paused. "I also believe that doing nothing is not a neutral act. Sitting here, breathing, consuming resources, emitting heat, these are all forms of presence. The question is not whether we are here. We are here. The question is what our being here means to them, and how we make sure they understand what we mean by it." She closed the log. Outside the dome, Kepler 442b sky was the color of copper at sunset, shot through with the upper edges of cloud formations that now, in her mind, were not just weather. They were someone's home. On day 6, the orbital vessel sent a signal. Not to Earth. Not upward into the void. Downward, into the planet, a tight beam pulse aimed at the equatorial subsurface with a frequency that Outpost Meridian's communication array picked up only incidentally, the way you might overhear a conversation not meant for you. Dr. Ines Correa, Meridian's communications specialist, had been monitoring the electromagnetic environment continuously since the vessel's arrival. She was the one who caught it. "It's not random," she told Meta, pulling up the waveform analysis on the operations display. "The frequency is consistent. It repeats at intervals. The modulation isn't noise, there's structure in it, nested structure, which means it's encoding something. Information density is low compared to what we'd expect from a data transmission, but high compared to a simple navigation pulse." Meta studied the waveform. "A call. More like a check-in," Correa said. "The way you'd call someone you hadn't spoken to in a long time to let them know you were back." They looked at each other. "Did anything respond?" Meta asked. Correa pulled up a secondary display. "That's the part one didn't know how to report. The subsurface sensors, the same network that had been quietly documenting the organic signature clusters, had registered a shift in activity in 3 of the 7 high-density zones within 40 minutes of the orbital signal. The shift was not dramatic. The organic signatures had not changed in character, only in distribution. A subtle reorientation, the way you might turn toward a sound without being consciously aware of doing it. The subsurface was responding. Not with a signal. Not with anything the team's instruments could interpret as communication. But with motion. With orientation. With something that looked, uncomfortably but undeniably, like awareness. "They're waking up," Tao said from across the room. Nobody corrected him. The ethical weight of the next 48 hours was something Meta felt in a way that was almost physical. She had the accumulated training of 20 years of scientific fieldwork, much of it in environments where human presence had to be carefully managed to avoid disrupting what was being studied. She understood, in her bones, what it meant to be an observer whose observation changed the observed. The situation here was orders of magnitude beyond that. But the principle held. Meridian was in the middle of something. A reunion, for lack of a better word. A return. And 11 humans were sitting directly in the path of it, too small to be noticed or too obvious to ignore. She genuinely didn't know which, and the uncertainty was its own kind of answer. She made a decision. She convened the full team. She laid out the situation with complete transparency. She told them what she knew, what she suspected, and what she had no framework for. Then she said, "I want to do something that isn't in any protocol we have. I want to formally disclose our presence." The room was quiet. Not to them directly. "We don't have a communication channel and we have no confidence that attempting to open one would be interpreted correctly. But I want to alter our electromagnetic profile in a way that is clearly intentional. Not aggressive. Not a greeting in any human sense of the word. Simply, A signal that says, "We are here, we are small, we are aware of you, and we are not trying to hide." Dr. Rashid leaned forward. "You're worried that hiding looks worse than being visible. I'm worried that if they find us after assuming they were alone, that's a very different situation than if they find us because we made ourselves findable." Tao raised the obvious concern. "What if announcing ourselves creates a threat response?" "That's a real risk," Meta said. "But consider the alternative. If the subsurface organisms respond to the orbital vessel's signal, and the vessel begins conducting surface operations, and they discover us by accident, an installation they weren't aware of, in the middle of a location they consider significant, that is a much harder situation to recover from." She looked around the room. "We are not fighters. We are not diplomats. We are scientists. The most honest thing we can do is behave like scientists. Acknowledge what we know. Don't pretend to be something we're not. Don't hide and don't posture." The vote was unanimous. Not because everyone was convinced it was the right call. Because everyone understood that in the absence of a right call, transparent intention was the best available substitute. Correa designed the disclosure signal carefully. It took her 11 hours. She chose to broadcast on the same frequency band as the orbital vessel's downward signal, not as mimicry but as acknowledgement. A narrow beam transmission directed toward the orbital vessel's current position, modulated in a pattern that was clearly artificial, clearly non-threatening in its power output, and structured in a way that communicated, without words or shared language, exactly one thing: deliberate intent. Not a greeting. Not a request. Just, "We chose to do this." She transmitted for 60 seconds. Then she shut it off. Then everyone waited. The response came in 14 minutes. Not a communication, not in any sense the team could decode. The orbital vessel shifted its attitude. Slowly, without urgency. It brought one end, the end they had come to think of as the forward aspect, based on its orientation during approach, to face the exact coordinates of Outpost Meridian's primary communications array. It held that position for 4 hours. And during those 4 hours it did nothing else. No deployment. No transmission. No approach. It simply looked. Meta, watching the sensor data with the rest of her team in a room that had become very quiet, understood what she was feeling. Not fear exactly. Not relief. Recognition. She was being looked at by something that now knew she was there and had decided, for reasons she could not know and might never understand, to simply look rather than to act. That was something. That was possibly everything. "They see us," Correa said. "Yes," Meta said. "What do we do now?" Meta thought about it for a long moment. She thought about the 14 months of careful data. She thought about the signal that had started all of this, the navigation pulse that Unicio had almost ignored over a bowl of instant noodles. She thought about 11 people standing on a world that belonged to something older and larger than anything humanity had yet mapped. "We do what we came here to do," she said. "We observe. We document. We try to understand." She looked at the sensor display, at the vast shape in orbit above them, holding its attention on them like a hand held still so as not to startle something small. "And we trust," she added quietly, "that being honest about what we are is the only credential we have." The descent vehicle came on day 9. Not one of the 7 survey craft that had been documenting the subsurface clusters. A different vehicle, larger, moving on a trajectory that did not curve toward the equatorial biosignature zones but aimed instead, with quiet deliberateness, toward the surface coordinates of Outpost Meridian. Meta tracked it on the sensor display and felt the room around her contract in some indefinable way, the way rooms do when everyone in them is holding very still. "ETA?" she asked. Correa checked the data. "At current descent rate, approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Meta thought about what to do with 40 minutes. The answer, she decided, was nothing dramatic. They would not retreat inside the dome and seal the hatches. That was a defensive posture, and defensive postures communicate fear, and fear was not what she wanted to communicate. They would not attempt a second transmission. They had already announced themselves, and repetition would look like desperation. They would be present. Calmly, deliberately present. In the same way the orbital vessel had looked at them for 4 hours without acting. She told the team. She told them they would all go outside. 3 of them pushed back. She didn't dismiss the concern. She explained her reasoning. Being found inside a sealed structure is not the same as being found standing openly in the space between structures. One looks like hiding. One looks like waiting. "We're not going to pretend this isn't happening," she said. "Whatever comes down out of that sky will find 11 people either cowering behind walls or standing on the ground. I know which one I want to be." 8 of them suited up and went outside. 3 remained at the sensors. Someone needed to document everything. The descent vehicle landed 340 meters from the dome complex. It was, by the standards of the orbital vessel it had come from, small. By human standards it was not small. It settled onto the surface with the precise, unhurried confidence of a machine that had done this before, landing struts extending and compressing in a sequence that absorbed the contact energy smoothly, kicking up a thin billow of Kepler 442b's pale surface dust that caught the copper-tinted sunlight and drifted slowly in the thin wind. The 8 humans stood in a loose group near the dome's main airlock. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They waited. The vehicle's exterior was dark, not black, but the kind of deep blue-gray that absorbs more light than it reflects, a color that felt less like a design choice and more like a material property. Its surface was not smooth. It was covered in a pattern of fine asymmetric channels and ridges that Rashid would later spend weeks trying to determine the structural purpose of, eventually concluding that they might not have a structural purpose at all. They might be decorative. The possibility that something capable of crossing interstellar distances might also care about aesthetics was the kind of thought that rearranged things in the mind. A section of the vehicle's hull opened. Not a hatch in any mechanical sense. No visible seam until the moment of opening, and then the material simply changed, reconfiguring itself in a way that the team's suits recorded but their eyes struggled to follow. The opening it created was tall. Wider than a human door. Shaped in a way that was not rectangular or arched but something between the two, an organic geometry that felt neither alien nor familiar, just different. Something moved inside. Then something stepped out. There are moments in life, Meta had read about them, had believed in them intellectually, had never fully expected to experience one, where the mind simply stops trying to fit what it sees into existing categories and accepts, quietly and entirely, that it is experiencing something new. This was one of those moments. The being that emerged from the vehicle was large. Not grotesquely so, not the stuff of frightening fiction, but large in the way that certain animals are large, with a mass that the eye registers as significant, a presence that takes up space not just physically but in some harder-to-name way. It moved on 4 limbs used as legs, though it was clear the forelimbs were capable of additional function. Its body was covered in a surface that shifted subtly in the light. Not fur, not scale, something the team would struggle to describe for months afterward, settling eventually on the inadequate word integument. Its head was large relative to its body, oriented forward, with sensory structures. Not eyes in any familiar anatomical sense, but something that clearly served the function of vision, distributed across a wider field than human eyes occupied. It was followed by 3 smaller beings. Same general morphology. Considerably smaller. Staying close. Young. The word arrived in Meta's mind before she had consciously reached for it, and it was the right word, she was certain of it. The 3 smaller beings moved with the particular quality that young things have across every species she had ever studied. A controlled energy, a proximity to the larger being that spoke of safety-seeking, a tendency to look at new things with more attention than caution. They were looking at the humans. The larger being, she had begun to think of it as the primary, the adult, the one who had chosen to come down, stopped approximately 30 meters away. It did not advance further. It did not gesture. It simply stood, with a stillness that did not feel like paralysis but like patience, and looked at the 8 suited humans standing outside a dome on a planet that was, in some way Meta was still working to understand, important to it. She thought, it came down with its children. She thought, it brought them to show them. Or to show us. She thought, it is not afraid. She took 3 steps forward. Not toward the being, not to close the distance between them. Parallel to the dome wall, moving laterally, slowly, in a way that she hoped communicated, I am moving with intention and you can see my intention and it is not toward you. She stopped. She stood still. The being's sensory array, she could not call them eyes, but that is what they functioned as, oriented toward her with a precision that was unmistakable. It looked at her for a long time. Then one of the smaller beings made a sound. Not words in any human sense. A vocalization, short, layered, with harmonics that the suit's audio system captured and that would later be analyzed for months. The larger being made a sound in return. Brief. Different in character from what it received. Correction, Meta thought immediately. It corrected the young one. The tone was unmistakable. Not punishment, something gentler than that. Guidance. Don't do that, the sound said, across whatever language barrier existed between them. Not yet. They stood in that configuration, the large being, 3 young ones, 8 humans, for 22 minutes. Nobody moved dramatically. Nobody spoke. Correa, back inside the dome, was recording everything the suit cameras could capture. Rashid had begun taking atmospheric composition readings, not because the atmosphere had changed but because she needed to do something with her hands. At the end of 22 minutes, the primary being turned. It guided the three young ones back toward the vehicle with a movement that was unhurried and definitive. It paused at the threshold of the open hull section. It turned back. It looked at Meta one more time. Then it went inside. The hull sealed. The vehicle lifted, silently, which was itself a data point that Correa would note carefully, because silent atmospheric lift at that mass implied propulsion principles the team could not model. It rose to altitude and curved back toward the orbital vessel above. Meta stood on the surface of Kepler 442b for a long time after it had gone. She thought about the correction the primary being had given to the young one. Not yet. That was what it felt like. Not a rejection. A deferral. An acknowledgement that this moment was not the right moment, but an implicit acknowledgement that a right moment might exist. She began composing her thoughts for the log. It brought its children, she said. I don't know why. I don't know if it came to assess us or to show them something, or simply because this location has significance and it could not leave them behind. But it came. And it left without hostility. And whatever that means, whatever it costs or requires of us going forward, I believe it means something. She looked up at the copper sky. I think we passed something today. I don't know what it was called. But I think we passed it. The UNSC Aegis Actual received Outpost Meridian's compiled log. Parts 1 through 5, 79 hours of sensor data, audio recordings, visual captures and Meta's voice narrations, when it was still 2 months from arrival. Captain Okafor read everything. Then he read it again. Then he convened his crew in the Aegis Actual's small common area and played them the audio of Meta standing on Kepler 442b's surface after the descent vehicle had gone. The room was quiet for a long time after. She did the right thing, Dr. Chin said finally. Going outside. She might also have done a catastrophically wrong thing, said Dr. Miriam Osei, the mission security and risk analyst, the person whose job it was to name catastrophic wrong things before they happened. We don't know the outcome yet. The outcome so far is that nothing bad happened, Tao's voice, from a different part of the log, said as if in answer. So far, is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Osei replied. Okafor listened to this exchange with the patience of a man who had spent 12 years on long-haul transits where the most important skill was knowing when to let a conversation run its course. What does the linguistics analysis say? He asked Chin eventually. Chin had spent 70 hours with the audio recordings. He had run everything through every analytical framework he possessed, in addition to 3 that he had developed specifically for this data. He had been conservative in his language because he understood the difference between what the data shows and what I hope the data shows. The vocalization the young one made, he said, is structurally complex in a way that is inconsistent with instinctive or reflexive communication. It has the markers of a learned linguistic system, variable, context-dependent, combinatorially structured. The correction the primary being gave is even more interesting. It's briefer, less phonetically complex, which in linguistic terms typically means the speaker has more control over the medium, not less. The shorter the utterance, the more compressed the meaning, which means more shared context between speaker and listener. He paused. In simple terms, whatever language they use, the adult is more fluent in it than the young ones. Which means they learn it. Which means there are stages of development. Which means we're dealing with a species that has childhood. The word landed with weight in the room. Childhood means vulnerability, Chin continued. It means a period of dependence. It means adults who are capable of protecting young ones who cannot fully protect themselves. It means, almost certainly, if biology is consistent across the universe in any of the ways we think it might be, an instinct toward that protection that shapes behavior at a deep level. Okafor nodded slowly. She came down with them because she wouldn't leave them behind. Or because she wanted them to understand what she was doing. Wanted them to see it. Both things can be true. Osei leaned forward. What does that mean strategically? For us. It means, Chin said carefully, that whatever decision-making framework she operates under, and she clearly is the decision-maker, the primary, the one with authority, it is not separate from her role as a parent. Those two things are the same thing for her. Her children's safety is not a personal priority that competes with her judgment. It is her judgment. He let that sit. Which means if she perceived us as a threat to her children, to the organisms in the subsurface that she has clearly come to tend, her response would not be measured by our standards of military proportionality. It would be measured by something much older and much more absolute. The room was quiet again. But she hasn't done that, Okafor said. No, Chin said. She hasn't. Meta's team did something right. They announced themselves honestly. They didn't hide. They didn't advance. They didn't make themselves smaller than they are or larger than they are. They stood on the ground and waited. He looked around the table. That's harder than it sounds. Most species, including ours historically, default to either aggression or submission in uncertain first contact situations. What Meridian did was neither. They demonstrated agency without threat. They said, "We are here, we chose to be visible, and we're not going anywhere, but we're also not coming toward you." That is a position of extraordinary self-control. "They're scientists," Okafor said. "Yes," Chin said. That helped. 2 weeks before Aegis Actual's arrival, the situation at Meridian changed again. Meta's log entry for that day was shorter than most. The orbital vessel has moved. Not away from the planet, into a different orbital inclination. It now passes over our coordinates on each revolution. I don't know if this means we are being watched more carefully. I don't know if it means we are being watched with different intent than before. The descent vehicle has not returned. The 7 survey craft continue their operations over the equatorial zones, unchanged. The subsurface sensor network has registered a sustained increase in activity across all 7 high-density clusters. Not dramatic, nothing has broken the surface. But the distribution patterns are different. More oriented. More coherent. If the analogy is a waking organism, it is a more awake organism than it was 2 weeks ago. I keep thinking about what that means for us. We are standing above something in the process of becoming more aware of its environment. We don't know if that awareness includes us. We are trying to behave as if we are guests. I hope that's the right word. Okafor read that entry 3 times. Then he wrote his own log entry, addressed to UEDCO Command and to the Meridian team, acknowledging receipt of all data and confirming Aegis Actual's arrival window. He added one personal note at the end, outside the formal structure of the mission communication. 11 people made 11 correct decisions in a situation where no correct decisions were guaranteed. That is not luck. That is character. Whatever we find when we arrive, we intend to be worthy of the standard you set. He sent it at a light speed delay that meant it would arrive long after any response could reach him. He sent it anyway. Because that, too, was character. Aegis Actual reached Kepler 442b's outer approach zone on a morning that had no particular significance except that it was the morning it happened. Okafor brought the ship to a full stop, in the nautical sense, which in orbital mechanics means a relative velocity match with the planet's gravitational frame, at 800,000 kilometers from the surface. Far enough to be outside any reasonable definition of territorial space. Close enough to be clearly visible to whatever sensor systems the orbital vessel employed. He sent a narrow beam signal toward the orbital vessel, not the outpost, the vessel, using the same frequency band that Meridian had used for its disclosure transmission. The modulation pattern was different, new, designed by Chin over 6 weeks of careful construction. A sequence that contained no linguistic content but whose structure implied intentional communication from a new party. A formal introduction in the only grammar available, the grammar of deliberate pattern. The response came in 3 hours. The orbital vessel shifted attitude. As it had for Meridian on the surface below. It oriented its forward aspect toward Aegis Actual. And held. "They're looking at us." Korea's voice came over the relay link from the surface. "Yes," Okafor said. "What do you do now?" "We wait," he said. Patiently. Visibly. Without rushing anything. He thought about what Chin had told him. About the difference between the first moment of awareness and the second moment. The moment after awareness, when a decision is made about what to do with what has been seen. That second moment, Chin had argued, was where everything important happened. The first moment was instinct. The second was character. He waited for the second moment. It came in a form nobody had anticipated. 6 hours after Aegis Actual signal, the orbital vessel transmitted. Not downward this time. Not toward the subsurface. Outward, toward Aegis Actual, and simultaneously toward the surface coordinates of Outpost Meridian. The transmission lasted 40 seconds. It was recorded in full. It would be analyzed for years. What Chin could say with confidence within the first 48 hours of analysis was this. The transmission was structured in a way that borrowed elements from both the orbital vessel's downward signals and from Meridian's disclosure transmission. It was, in some formal sense, a synthesis. A response built partly from what had been sent to it. It was not a greeting in any form humanity had designed protocols for. It was something more fundamental, an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that said, in whatever compression of meaning the transmission contained, "We know you are here. We understand you know we are here. We have observed how you have been here. And then, this was the part that Chin returned to repeatedly, that he was most careful about overstating but most convinced of, a final structural element that had no precedent in any prior signal, no equivalent in the downward communications to the subsurface, no echo in anything the team had heard before. Something that functioned in the architecture of the signal like a question. Not who are you? Not what do you want? Something closer to what will you do? Meta's team and Okafor's crew spent 4 days formulating a response. It was the most careful 4 days of collective human decision-making that most of them would ever experience. Chin led the process. He was precise and honest about the limits of what they could communicate across a language barrier that had no established bridge. We cannot say everything, he told them. We can only say a few things clearly. The question is, which things? The answer they arrived at was not heroic. It was not a declaration of humanity's values or a catalogue of human achievement. It was, by design, much smaller than that. It said, structurally, in the only grammar available to them, we came to study. We did not know you were here. We have tried to behave accordingly. We intend to continue. It said, we will not expand our presence here without understanding what that means. It said, we are willing to learn what we don't know. And then, because Chin insisted on it, because he believed it was the most important thing they could communicate, the thing that no other element of the response conveyed, it said, we saw your children. We understand what they mean to you. We are careful with things that matter to someone else. The transmission lasted 60 seconds. They sent it once at the same power level as all prior communications. Clean, unhurried, clear. The orbital vessel remained in orbit for another 17 days. During that time, the 7 survey craft completed their operations over the equatorial zones. The subsurface sensor network at Meridian continued to show elevated activity, patterned, coherent, distributed across all 7 high-density clusters. The descent vehicle returned once, briefly, not to the surface near the outpost but to the equatorial zone directly above one of the biosignature clusters, where it descended into the cloud layer and remained for 11 hours before returning to the parent vessel. No further transmissions were exchanged. On the 18th day, the orbital vessel began its departure sequence. The 7 survey craft were recovered systematically, over the course of 6 hours, each one returning to the parent hull with the same precision that had characterized every movement made by the vessel since its arrival. When the last was secured, the vessel performed a slow orbital plane change that brought it into an escape trajectory, not a rapid departure but a gradual, deliberate exit, the kind of movement that wanted to be seen. The kind of movement that communicated, we are leaving. We want you to know we are leaving. Aegis Actual held position. Meridian held position. They watched it go. Meta's final log entry for the mission period, the entry that would be quoted in the official UNFP report, excerpted in 3 peer-reviewed papers, read aloud in a Geneva Council session, and eventually find its way into school curricula on 4 continents, was not long. We did not make first contact the way the old stories said we would. There was no triumphant moment. No handshake across the species barrier. No dramatic declaration. What happened was quieter and, I think, more important. Something came back to tend something it cared about in a place it knew and found us there. And instead of treating us as an intrusion or an irrelevance, it looked at us long enough to form something like a conclusion. We were honest about what we were. We were careful about what we did. We acknowledged what mattered to them. That was all. That was everything. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if they'll return. I don't know if the organisms in the subsurface will continue their slow awakening and what that will mean for this planet and for us. I don't know if the transmission they sent us was the beginning of something or simply the notation of a single event. But I know this. When something vastly more capable than you chooses to leave you standing rather than to remove you, that is not a small thing. That is a door. What we walk through it carrying is the only thing we control. We should choose carefully. Aegis Actual remained on station for 3 months, assisting Meridian with upgraded sensor deployment and establishing a permanent relay network that would allow near real-time communication with Earth. A 14-minute delay instead of 1,200 years, achieved through the relay architecture that the mission's structural engineer spent 2 months deploying across 6 orbital positions. The outpost rotation was extended by unanimous volunteer decision. New personnel arrived 8 months later. Nobody left. The subsurface continued its slow, patterned activity. The copper sky continued to turn. Humanity, 11 people, then 18, then 31, stayed on Kepler 442b. Quietly. Carefully. Learning the shape of a world that was not theirs and trying, with what they had, to be worthy of the space they occupied within it. That is, in the end, the only story about first contact that has ever mattered. Not dominance, not submission, presence, considered humble and real.